Have a seat. So it is my great pleasure on behalf of the Al-Walid Center for American Studies and Research to introduce our distinguished guest today, W.T. Mitchell. He is a professor of English and art history at the University of Chicago and the editor of Critical Inquiry. And his books on visual culture image theory, and media range over topics such as war, racism, political theater, artistic movements, iconoclasm, the Palestinian landscape, and dinosaurs. And for his part in the recent debate over the boycott of Israeli institutions, you can see the Critical Inquiry blog. And in particular, since this is the very last talk of the year, it's really a great honor to have someone of your stature here. And so please join me in welcoming Professor Mitchell.
Well, thanks very much, Lisa. Can you all hear me? Is this okay? This is my first time in Beirut, and I think I came at the right time of year. It's just unbelievably beautiful, and we're spending a whole week here, which I'm delighted at. If you get tired of listening to me, my wife, Janice Miserel, who's sitting in the second row there, is going to be doing musical performances 2 nights this week, so check in with her if you would like to hear avant-garde vocal and flute music. I hope that the talk I'm giving today won't be, as they say, bringing ice cubes to the Eskimos. I'm sure there are a lot of people in this room who have much more detailed and intimate familiarity with this topic than I do. And in some ways, I wrote it for an American audience. But I thought it might be worth it to try it out here to see what kind of response it would get. The title, as you can probably guess, is a reflection of divided emotions, ambivalence, internal conflicts. I have many friends, very, very dear and longtime friends in Israel who I care about a lot. I also have many friends, very dear and longtime friends in Palestine who I care a lot about. And the idea that this is a constant state of colonization, domination, exploitation, inequality, and really terrible violence is extremely disturbing. Even though we live far away from it, it's something that is constantly on my mind. So let me say something about first this title, Salvaging Israel-Palestine, Art, Collaboration, and the Binational State. First, just the linking of the names Israel-Palestine and dividing them by a slash is my way of saying I think that this is one condition, that it is one state or situation already in which all of the power and the money is basically in the hands of Israel, and the Palestinians are doing their best within that condition. So when I say binational state, I am not talking about the notion of the binational solution. I'm talking about a state not as a governmental entity, but as a condition, or as we say, a state of affairs, the situation in which Jews and Arabs, Christians and Muslims, all variety of peoples are living together, but there is this sharp dividing line in terms of political power and economic power, and above all, control of territory and of the means of violence. So that's what this slashed entity is. The idea of salvaging comes from a current art movement. I'm going to talk about several kinds of art movements today that I think are relevant to this whole situation. But let me illustrate, not with anything from Israel-Palestine, but from Italy. Michelangelo Pistoletto, one of the great pioneers of what was called art Pauvre, the art of poverty, making something out of nothing, particularly making beauty out of ruins or out of leftovers, out of trash, and so forth. Pistolettos. In a way, this is an allegory of that very process, showing the Venus sort of burrowing into a pile of leftover rags. And so you might think of that as an emblem of this movement, which I think has gained a lot of force in our time, of salvage art. It's an international movement. You would find practitioners of it in India, all over the Middle East, and in America, in my own neighborhood, in Chicago's South Side, and particularly the areas around Hyde Park, where the university is. So that's one branch of art that I'm going to look at. It's not the only one. I'm also very interested in directly political art, propaganda. I refuse to be a snob about propaganda. I know as an art historian, I'm supposed to be able to tell the difference between agitprop and, quote, real art. But I think often agitprop is real art, and sometimes real art is nothing but agitprop for, the art market. So these categories are going to be blurred. Political art and what you might call aesthetic art, complicated, ambiguous art, or even better, useless art, the kind that you can't do anything with. All you can do is look at it and hope that it gives you ideas. And then a third kind of thing that I'm very interested in, that's documentary. And this will have a lot to do with cinema, particularly filmmaking on both sides of the Israel-Palestine situation. So those are the things I mean by art here. And then collaboration. This is as you probably know, a dangerous and toxic word inside Israel-Palestine. For Palestinians, to call somebody a collaborator could potentially be a death sentence. It means you are working with the enemy, sleeping with the enemy, giving them information. It's equivalent to treason. From the Israeli side, it's a term of contempt. They think that collaborators are useful, but weak and easily manipulated. So it's a very nasty word. And I put it in this talk because I want to just detoxify it a little bit. As you know, I think Derrida pointed out long ago that every poison also has maybe a moment of medicinal character in it. So I'm looking for that medicinal form, the therapeutic form of collaboration, often which is unintentional, but involves some kind of interplay, and usually at the level of artistic practices. That doesn't mean that I'm saying the arts are above politics or outside the conflict. This is about arts that are enmeshed inside the conflict. Finally, I've been struggling with the question of what is the overall form of this whole problem? How can we think about it? And since, among other things, I love to reflect on the way cinema teaches us things, it occurred to me that probably one of the oldest cinematic techniques might be applicable. It's called shot, reverse shot. And it sounds like the encounter of enemies. One shoots, the other one shoots back. But in cinema, shot, reverse shot is the structure of a conversation. It's the moment, and it's a deeply loaded kind of phrase and a practice, because it involves looking back at the other, even looking back at the enemy, and it can be very difficult to achieve sometimes, and it comes out of the reason we call a shot in cinema a shot is because the original film apparatus was based on the machine gun, basically making multiple shots. Movies are made up of thousands of stills, as you know, just like the thousands of shots in a machine gun. So the relation between the gun and the camera, a very deep issue. And I thought I'd start with what I think is going to be the most appalling, awful example of this. A T-shirt worn by a young Israeli man, which is awful in what it says, what it implies, but also because it was shot by an anonymous cameraman and put on the internet and recorded, it provides a kind of revelation. It shoots back at this terrible crosshairs and reveals something that Israelis would prefer not to talk about, and that's the hidden agenda of the occupation, which is the manifest agenda is always we want peace, we want the Palestinians to be quiet, we want them to accept that they are defeated people, etc. But the real motive is we want their land, we want all of it, and we would like them to leave. And so it's a policy whose deep reality is one of ethnic cleansing. To say this in the U.S. You're going to almost always get some kind of fairly violent reaction to it. I don't know if you've been following the American election, but recently Bernie Sanders made the mistake in a debate of saying the outrageous thing that the Palestinians actually are human beings and they have a point of view. And maybe Benjamin Netanyahu is not right all the time. The outrage that greeted that in the New York Times and elsewhere was really palpable. So this is my first and I think the most disturbing example of the shot reverse shot logic, where one shot reveals what is behind the motive of another shot. I'm also want to just, this is a map which Americans rarely see, and in fact, it would have been part of a new book, kind of standard textbook of Middle Eastern geography, published by McGraw-Hill Publishing. It would have been a standard textbook for high schools all over America. The Israel lobby had it removed. They insisted that it was a prejudicial map and that it was anti-Semitic and, of course, obviously anti-Zionist. Of course, if you look at it for a minute, you realize it is basically just an objective map of what land has been occupied under some form of not even political, but at least police control inside the Palestinian territories, a shrinking, tiny fragment of the state. And so it's very difficult now for Americans to see this map. It's regarded as out of bounds. A more detailed map, this one seems to show that there are contiguous, very tiny but contiguous Palestinian territories. But the fact is, because of things like flying checkpoints, the surprise arrival of interdiction on any given road or path, there really is no reliable Palestinian territory that is adjacent. And this is by Eyal Weizmann, an Israeli geographer. I want to look now, just for a few minutes, at a couple of Israeli artists who I think, on all sides of a conflict, you have honest people who try to look at the way things are. And Abramson's work it fits not on the agitprop or propaganda side, but I would say on the reflective, contemplative side of art that addresses the occupation of Palestine. It's an image cut out from a real estate magazine of a settler's bungalow, inserted into a sea of abstraction. Basically, the green lawn, the blue sky, the suburban dream of the settler. And this is connected in Abramson's view to a general preference for abstract art that has been there in the Israeli art world for the last half century. And Abramson is also a critic as well as a painter. And so this is a kind of a deconstruction of the Israeli cult of abstraction, showing how what it does is it erases the environment around it. It produces a kind of invisibility in the landscape so that you don't have to look at the consequences of your own occupation. Along that same line is this very powerful photograph by Mickey Craftsman of something that preceded the notorious security wall, or as some call it, the apartheid wall, that divides Israel-Palestine. And by the way, I think it's not quite right to say that it divides Israel-Palestine. What it actually does is it reaches deep into what was Palestinian territory and makes movement impossible, sometimes surrounding entire villages like Qalqilia. This particular security wall was built by the settlement Gilo near in east of Jerusalem, and it covers up the view of the village on the far hillside by Jolla, a Palestinian village, and replaces it with what you might call an Arabian pastoral landscape, a pacified landscape. So it's trompe-l'oeil painting, and it was painted by some young Russian immigrant painters who had been trained in socialist realism. According to the master's thesis that was written about this particular wall, the painters were very unhappy about the job. They said, you know, we thought in leaving Russia and leaving socialist realism that we had left all this behind. We find we've come right back into it. This is a photo of not just propaganda art, but art that basically camouflages or covers up a situation, tries to disappear the real Palestinian village in favor of an imaginary one that is no threat. Craftsman does a lot of this kind of, again, what I would call shot reverse shot, of photographing the occupation, making it visible, because one thing about the occupation is that it steadfastly tries to render itself invisible to the occupiers. If you were to live in Tel Aviv, you'd scarcely know there was an occupation. You would rarely meet somebody from the West Bank. The Palestinians would be rendered basically invisible. This photograph, I think, takes that shot and reverses it. This is another angle on it where suddenly you see what the wall is doing. In this one, the wall does its work. Seen askance or seen from an angle, it reveals the kind of cut that it produces in the actual landscape. And here Craftsman again is both recording the object but finding a moment in it where it breaks and reveals its own artificiality. And another project he's been working on recently is tracking the steady disappearance of the Bedouins, who leave behind markers of this kind or places where they stop to camp. But the Israelis are trying to remove the Bedouins now from the countryside. They don't want people who move freely. They want everybody to pass through checkpoints and to be documented. So the Israeli army goes around removing these territorial markers. So their disappearance, their removal is fundamental to the occupation. And that's why Craftsman makes his project the preservation of the image of them, to keep that visible. I went to a documentary film festival some years ago in Tel Aviv, and I was sent 20 films in advance, and I was asked to meditate on them, give my reactions. Of the 20 films, I would say 18 were about the occupation. That is, the filmmakers at Tel Aviv University were all determined to document, record, and critique what their own government was doing. One of the films was called What I Saw in Hebron, and I don't imagine I have to explain to anybody the significance of Hebron, a city of in which about a couple hundred Jews live in the midst of a very large city, about 75,000, I believe, and the army protects that small cult of right-wing Israelis inside Hebron, and it's a constant point of irritation. But Hebron was not always this way. What I saw in Hebron is a documentary that takes you back to 1929 and the Hebron massacre, when 69 members of a yeshiva were massacred. What is generally forgotten is that there were many more Jews living in Hebron at the time, and the Arab residents of Hebron protected them, hid them away. And it was as much about a split between Ashkenazi and Sephardic or Arab Jews as it was about a split between Jews and Arabs. There was more than one kind of conflict going on. So the descendants of the Arab and Jewish families from Hebron convened and were interviewed by the filmmaker, who at this point talks about what it was like, what happened then, and what the relation was of Jewish and Arab families in Hebron in those days. Sorry, the sound is very quiet, but I think you'll see from the subtitles. So I don't mean to suggest that everything was milk and honey or it was a utopia in the 1920s, but this film brings together the descendants of those families and reminds us of a time when Jews and Arabs in Hebron were, as they say, milk cousins, because babies would be passed back and forth. When a mother's milk didn't come in, a neighbor would be called on. And they shared names as well. So it's not like there is, the contrast I would draw would be to Europe, where anti-Semitism is an ancient and fixed creed that has a lot to do with Christianity, almost nothing to do with Islam. As you know, there was a time when anti-Semitism applied quite equally to both Arabs and Jews. Think of Shakespeare for the moment. Two plays about race hatred in Christendom: The Merchant of Venice, about anti-Semitism, and Othello, about fear of the Moor. The only difference is the Moor is a warrior. He's a formidable military enemy. The Jew is the enemy within, the moneylender. But the real source of anti-Semitism, it always makes me laugh when people say the Arabs are anti-Semitic, because I just don't think it makes that much sense. I think it's really, Christianity is the one that needs to look in the mirror on this particular subject. Another documentary film that I think is very important to give a sense of what goes on at the innumerable checkpoints. At this point, there are over 500 permanent checkpoints all over the West Bank, and an uncountable number of what they call flying checkpoints. This is the kind of thing that is daily practice at a major checkpoint. Whoops, no.
חיות, דיסקאברי. כל המעלה זה ג'ונגל, יש שם קופים כלבים. גורילות. הבעיה שהחיות עכשיו סגורות שם, לא עושה. מה? לא, אנחנו בני אדם, לא חיות. זה היה אין צלם ממנו, שלנו יש. זה ההבדל בין... מה? תצטרף, אוכל את זה, מה שלנו, יש לנו אותה. תראי כמה המתקלית.
So what I find shocking about this little clip from, it's a 1-hour fly-on-the-wall documentary surveying the behavior of border guards all over the West Bank. It isn't so much the kind of the terrible racism that's being expressed here, it's the shamelessness that goes with it, that he doesn't care if the chief of staff hears about it, that he's confident that this is, it doesn't matter how it's shown. It will not have any effect. And this is why I insist on showing this in the United States, where people say, well, this kid must be crazy. This is an exception. No, actually, listen to what he's saying. He's saying, this is normal. He doesn't care if the chief of staff hears about it. And I think for that reason, it's a really important use of cinema to document the reality, the facts on the ground that make the occupation what it is. It's also the kind of thing that can only be done, of course, by an Israeli filmmaker. A Palestinian filmmaker can't make Checkpoint. They cannot get the camera into position to film this kind of behavior. So as a form of resistance to the occupation, it seems to me it's the kind that can only come from the Israelis and therefore very important. Another kind of documentation that comes from the Palestinian side is by a young artist named Khalid Girar, lives in Ramallah. This is called Journey 110. The title is named after a passageway through a kind of sewer pipe that is the unauthorized route between Ramallah and Jerusalem. If you want to go without having to pass through a checkpoint, this is the way you go. This film is about 12 minutes long, and it is a loop meant to go over and over to convey the idea that this is not so much a narrative of a passage from one place to another as a kind of condition that cycles within itself. It's also, you never see a face in this. All these people are committing a crime, of course. They're bypassing a checkpoint in order to get to Jerusalem. And as you can see, it's an extremely precarious passage. It's filthy, it's hard on your feet, and if you see the full version of this, you'll see, I often see women taking their high-heeled shoes, putting them in a plastic bag, and then going barefoot through this terrible passageway. I think it also shows, Girard's point is to show people are not going to be stopped. The Palestinians are just as stubborn as the Jews, and they will not be denied passage from one part of their country to another. Maybe temporarily, maybe for a while, but this is the kind of thing that human beings tend to do. They're very, very difficult to stop, to fence in. And if this one seems a bit depressing, I have a couple of others, just short clips that I want to show you, which I think also portray this, what I'm calling this motif of looking back, the shot, reverse shot logic. This is a piece much longer than what I'm going to show, called Chic Point, a Palestinian fashion show. Have any of you seen this before? Good, I'm glad I'm not showing everything that you've already seen, but Lisa has. Anyway, here is Chic Point. This is a parody of all of the usual cliches of the fashion show and the fashion show video, showing the usual very, very good-looking models, in this case all male, with bored looks on their faces, parading up and down the runway. But the fashions they're showing are all invented clothing for passing through checkpoints, so that men can bare their midriffs to show that they're not wearing a suicide vest. And there's something further to this. I mean, the fact that it is, I think the situationists would have called this a classic détournement of both the world of fashion on the one side and the way fashion is filled with erotic and exotic coding, that this is where human beings dress up to be attractive, to make some kind of statement that arouses desire in the spectator. And yet, this is a fashion show that's, in principle, addressed to Israeli border guards, saying, here's what the well-dressed Palestinian man wears these days when passing through a checkpoint, presumably to techno rock and roll as well. So it's a strange, parodic example, and I think it exemplifies something else that's characteristic of a lot of Palestinian resistance art. That is, that it's not just about melancholic or depressed complaining about a condition. It's often about incredibly inventive satire, humor, making fun of the occupation, making fun of the Israelis. And having visited the West Bank numerous times over the last 20 years, I can tell you it's a very accurate reflection, at least of my sense of the Palestinian relation to the occupation. That is, it does not seem to, as John Berger put it, drive them into some state of despair, despite all the things they have to deal with. I want to mention just a couple of other conceptual performances that I think had a great effect and also helped to draw international attention to the occupation. One is Khalid Girar's two projects, one that involved bringing Picasso to Ramallah. You can imagine getting a Picasso on loan from a European museum, insuring it, and bringing it to a place that is not a state, that is occupied territory. It was extremely difficult. the bureaucratic procedures were endless. And yet he managed to do it because, after all, it's just a painting, just a work of art, has nothing to do with the occupation. It was simply the gesture, the moving of that painting from Europe to Ramallah, that was a kind of statement which brought out into the open all of the obstacles to doing something as simple as borrowing a work of art and displaying it in a different place. The other project Harani pioneered was he issued certificates in a lot of Arab countries around Palestine. You can't work, you can't get a work permit. So if you're an auto mechanic, a bricklayer, and you need to go outside of Palestine to get work, it can be very difficult to do it legally. Harani noticed that there was a loophole in the laws of many Arab countries which makes an exemption if you're an artist. So he produced a kind of association of Palestinian artists, a paper organization, for which he issued membership cards and certificates of membership, which he gave to anybody who wanted to go and work somewhere. But they had to insist that their work was really artistic, that they were repairing your automobile as a work of art and not doing so, just as another mechanic. So, I mean, when people ask, what is art? One of the things the Palestinians, I think, have realized that anything can be art, that it's a nominalist framework. Certainly Duchamp taught us that a long time ago when he turned a urinal upside down, called it Fountain, and signed it Armut, and put it in an exhibition. The Palestinians understand that also is a form of salvage art. You take the thing that looks like it's worthless and you declare it to be art. And that act of transformation, it may or may not have effects, but it's a wonderful kind of experiment. And I think Harani really showed us a new way to make a performance out of the most ordinary thing. Last example of a Palestinian conceptual work by a young female artist, Shuruk Harb, also of Ramallah, who tried to think of a way in which the law of return, the Israeli law of return, any Jew who can prove that they are Jewish can claim the law of return and move to Israel. And so she asked herself the question, how can we Palestinians turn this law to our advantage? So what she proposed, and this has never been done, and I'm sure never will be done, but the proposal, very risky, controversial, was to find a suitably qualified rabbi to administer a conversion ritual to the entire Palestinian population, all on the same day. And then to have them all immediately file for residency under the law of return so that they could live in their own house and in their own country as a full Israeli citizen. Again, this is like renaming something. Art as a reframing or renaming of a situation, an object. It isn't so much about painting or fabricating something, but changing the way you think of it. And I think it's just as important in its way, especially for this practice I'm calling salvage art, where you basically are taking the worthless and putting it to work for something. So just a couple of general reflections on this. The relation of, I think, Palestinian and an Israeli culture is one of what I would call symbiosis with a kind of agonistic interwoven history, where people find themselves locked together in an ongoing struggle. And this has been, I think, some of the best artists, writers of our time, of the last 50 years, have acknowledged this. For instance, Mahmoud Darwish, the great Palestinian poet, acknowledged that his own bilingualism in Hebrew and Arabic was crucial to his own identity. He said, he once confesses, I make love in Hebrew, even though the poetry mainly in Arabic. Or the attitude that Edward Said expressed toward the achievements of Zionism, his refusal to simply reduce it to a racial ideology or a racism, and his recognition of the reality of the Holocaust. I can't tell you how many times I heard Edward speak where somebody tried to lure him into making an anti-Semitic statement or in simply equating Zionism with racism. Edward was very wary and very careful not to do that. He did not want to produce a rhetorical framework in which understanding reconciliation would be impossible. So, and he was faithful, of course, to that spirit of the great humanist Goethe, and named, he and Daniel Barenboim named the West-East Divan after Goethe's proposal. Said sometimes described the interwoven histories of Israelis and Palestinians as a musical symphony, a tragic symphony filled with counterpoint. So that's another way to think about the shot-reverse shot relation I'm talking about. Edward, with his deep sympathy and his numerous friendships with Jews, Barenboim, with his sympathy for the Palestinians. In fact, Barenboim, I believe now, is actually a citizen, if there is such a thing, of Palestine. In fact, the fictional, that question, is there such a thing as a citizen of Palestine, is something I'm going to come to in a little bit. Well, here's a transitional moment for us, and this is, I wonder how many of you know about Godard's film, Noremusique, in which he reflects briefly on the origin of Israel-Palestine. And this clip, I think, is very interesting in that regard. Let me just play it for you.
Par exemple, en 1948, les Israélites marchent dans l'eau vers la terre promise. Les Palestiniens marchent dans l'eau vers la noyade. Chant et contre-chant. Chant et contre-chant. Le peuple juif rejoint la fiction. Le peuple palestinien documentaire.
So Godard obviously is the one who gave me the fundamental idea of thinking of this in those cinematic terms of shot, reverse shot. I think his analysis of this oversimplifies a little bit. As you've seen already, it isn't that documentary is on one side and fictional film on the other. Both sides employ numerous artistic strategies to try to address, criticize, ridicule, and otherwise find a way of salvaging morally or physically the wreckage that Israel-Palestine is today. Another film that tries to do this by way of not shot, reverse shot, but the conversation is Avi McGraw B's wonderful film, Avenge But One of My Two Eyes. The title of this film is taken from the Bible, from the book of Judges, in the story of Samson. When Samson has been blinded and is imprisoned by the Philistines and tied between the pillars, he calls upon God to help him avenge but one of my two eyes by giving me back my strength. So I will pull down the temple, and that will kill me, I'll be killed, but so will all of them. So it's the image of the suicide pact. McGraw B's film is a documentary in which he is sitting in his studio talking on the telephone to an invisible Palestinian interlocutor. We never see the Palestinian, we do hear his voice. And they're talking about the occupation. That conversation is intercut with McGraw B going into the West Bank and filming the settlements and some of the rituals of the settlements. The most important ritual that he witnesses is one that I've witnessed myself. Many years ago, actually, 1987, I visited Israel and went to a place called Masada, the famous last holdout of the Zealots against the Romans. And at Masada, I was given a lesson by the tour guide, a lesson which is apparently repeated many times every day, and McGraw B catches it on his film. I call it the Masada complex. The idea was that the Jews, rather than being taken prisoner by the Romans, would commit collective suicide. And that's its connection with the Samson story. It's about committing suicide rather than being conquered. In McGraw B's film, the interesting thing is that after the tour guide gives his little narrative of how the Zealots killed themselves, a Jewish girl from New York raises an objection. She points out that suicide is against Jewish law, and she says, and besides, the women and children didn't commit suicide. They were killed by their husbands and fathers. So she said there's really something obscene about this whole story. I totally reject it. Well, what McGraw B reveals alongside this moment of resistance to this terrible story is that these two notions, the Samson option and the Masada complex, are actually state-of-the-art terms inside the Israeli security complex. But that's the last resort. That since we have nuclear weapons, we have a way of taking the world with us if we're ever in danger of being conquered. So it's a dark and disturbing film that, like many of these things, reveals things you may not want to know, but which are true and have to be understood. But I think probably the most interesting cinematic collaboration, I imagine many of you have seen, how many here have seen Five Broken Cameras? I see. Okay, quite a few. For the rest of you, I would recommend it highly. It's a film by a Palestinian farmer, Ahmad Bernat, who, and this is my one example of an actual, fairly straightforward collaboration. It was co-directed by Bernat and Guy Davidi, an Israeli filmmaker. The title refers to the cameras that Bernat used to document the encroaching occupation on his village of Bil-In in the West Bank. It's really quite an amazing film. The broken cameras, of course, are broken by the Israeli army in the process of filming making the film over 5 years. I'm just going to show you one clip from it. I have several, but this one is my favorite. You'll see right away why. This is such a typical situation. Bil-In is famous for nonviolent demonstrations of all kinds. It's kind of the figurehead of Palestinian resistance using the classic techniques of nonviolent civil disobedience. And characteristically, those events end up like this, with the Israeli army charging, taking over with violence. But the formal issue I wanted to point out here is that the way you see this film as a film is utterly dependent on the collaboration of the two artists. It is a classic example of shot reverse shot. One person speaking, saying, listen, be reasonable, you know, we're not here to hurt you, so forth. Then noticing that that the Palestinians behind him are starting to realize they're not messing around. They're coming with rubber bullets and tear gas grenades, both of which, by the way, can be completely lethal. People have been killed by having tear gas grenades fired directly at them, and rubber bullets are extremely lethal as well. So it is a product of a collaborative moment of artists. You couldn't see this without camera people on both sides. I'm not going to bother with this clip, which shows you the moment of the breaking of the final camera, which actually saves the cameraman's life. He says at one point that, and a lot of people who try to photograph the occupation express this. They say, when you have the camera in front of you, it gives you this false sense of security, as if you have invisible armor on. He says, it's an absolute fantasy. You're not safe at all. And in fact, holding the camera is like holding up a red flag in front of a bull. It invites retaliation by the Israelis. In this particular clip, Bernat has the camera up to his eye, and the camera shatters because a sniper's bullet has entered it. It saved his life. Otherwise, if he hadn't been holding the camera, the bullet would have gone through his head. At the same time, 5 Broken Cameras was revealing the nature of the occupation from a micro level, that is, from the village of Bil'in and inside the West Bank. In exactly the same year, the Israelis produced a film called The Gatekeepers, which, if you look at these films as bookends, parallel, they really are terrific. You can see right away from the DVD that The Gatekeepers is all about the point of view of the surveillance state. These are the multiple cameras, and there are security cameras everywhere. The wall is riddled with them, watchtowers riddled with them. So the Israeli security state controls visually great swatches of the West Bank. So it's just the opposite of the kind of up-close and personal view that you get with with 5 Broken Cameras. But these two films, by the way, were both nominated for the Academy Award for documentary in the same year. They were both finalists. The Israelis then, noticing this, tried to take credit for 5 Broken Cameras. They said, since one of our people was co-director, Guy Davidi didn't fall for it. He said, the real filmmaker here is Ahmad Bernat. I just worked with him, that's all. But at least the Israelis showed some good taste in trying to take credit for 5 Broken Cameras. The moral of The Gatekeepers, which is basically a series of interviews with the heads of Shin Bet, the Israeli security service, the moral is repeated over and over. I mean, these are, the moral is simple. The security state has been a failure. It's not made Israel more secure. It's made it a pariah internationally. It's produced an international boycott, which I'm part of and a lot of other people are. I hope it grows and prospers. But these are not nice liberal or progressive people testifying to the failure of the security state. These are the heads of Shin Bet, 5 different heads covering something like 25, 30 years of the Israeli security state and declaring it's been an utter failure. So it's the kind of testimony, very difficult to say, well, they don't know what they're talking about, since they are the ones who've enforced this regime. Okay, well, I'm going to wind up pretty quickly here. I wanted to mention another project. This is a bit like what I saw in Hebron, only it's in the form of historical archival documentary. And one thing artists more and more do, if you're a salvage artist, one thing you have to do is research. You don't just make it up in your studio, you look things up. Probably one of the greatest archivists of the last 20, 30 years in Israel is Ariella Azaleh, who produced a modest little film called Civil Alliance Palestine, 1947-48, in which she brought together Jews and Arabs to recite from documents in the Haganah archives. The Haganah, before the Israeli Defense Force Haganah was the Israeli military wing. What the Haganah archives recorded was what was going on all over Palestine in these small villages. Not just what was going on in Jerusalem in the center of the fighting, but what was happening in the tiny towns. And it turned out that Haganah recorded hundreds, literally hundreds of meetings in villages in which Israeli or Jewish and Palestinian leaders, town leaders, the elders, were getting together and trying to figure out a way to head off what was coming, which was the Nakba. Neither side wanted it. They were neighbors. These were long-standing family alliances. So that's a map of Israel on that table, and as they read from the archives, the narrative of these meetings, a white tile is put down on that village. By the end of the film, the entire map of historic Palestine is covered with white stones. It was the Zionist leaders in Jerusalem and Haganah itself that wanted war and wanted to drive the Palestinians out, which they did, as you know, 750,000 people, who basically subjected to military terrorism. But what Azaleh has done is to reconstruct an actual alternate history, like an infant stifled in its cradle, that would have given us a different kind of world. Then I mentioned before the question of the Palestinian citizen. Can you be a Palestinian citizen? A citizen of Palestine? Well, Khalid Girar has simply done what artists often do. If you haven't got it, imagine it. Think of what it would look like. This is a picture of my passport. This is not the one I showed, by the way, arriving at the airport this morning. I don't think it would have gotten me in. But it is, the Israelis have never even noticed it. I'm surprised. They seem to overlook it. Also, we wanted to mention, I haven't talked so far about artists who are actually Israeli citizens, Israeli Palestinians. And this is one of my favorite painters of the 1980s, a young man who died, unfortunately, quite young, Asim Abu Shakra. And Abu Shakra became, he died at around age 28, but in his short life, he painted hundreds of gorgeous expressionist canvases, all of them with the same theme. The Sabra plant, the cactus, which grows everywhere, as you know, in the Palestinian mountains. It's often used as a hedge around an orchard to keep the critters out. But it is also, it became a symbol, what you might call the totem of Israeli native identity. To be a Sabra means you were born in Israel. You did not emigrate there. So it's a mark of distinction. So Asim Abu Shakra made multiples of these paintings of the Sabra plant. But to what effect? Well, as I said, they became collector's items. The wealthy Israelis have these hanging on their walls. The thing that is strange about them is they're all potted plants. They're not rooted in the soil of the land. They are movable, transportable. So it's as if he was smuggling in this incredibly ironic commentary on the whole cult of the Sabra. And it's just a shame that he died so young, because an incredibly talented painter who could have done anything, but this is what he did in his short life. Here's Abba Eban, the Foreign Affairs Minister of Israel, Deputy Prime Minister, Ambassador to the UN, holding his own little personal Sabra. A last allegory, this comes back to Larry Abramson, who I mentioned before, who created a kind of mythical, allegorical painting, which he called Eliakim Chalakim. And the meaning of that phrase is, it's a proper name, the name of the great artist of the future who will unify the nation. So it's a kind of an image of prophecy and of synthesis. Abramson is, as you can see, an abstract painter, a modernist. And what he's done, though, is to produce a kind of collage or assemblage of absolutely dissonant elements from the whole modernist canon. One is the black square from Malevich, the origins of European modernism. But if that is the breastplate on Eliakim Chalakim, the sword is the crescent of Islam. And then there's a little plant which you can hardly see, the Rose of Jericho, which has symbolic meaning for both Palestinians and Israelis. It's supposed to be a plant that spends most of its very long life dead. But if you put a drop of water on it, it's suddenly poof, and they show up in the deep desert. Now, you might ask, well, what was the origin of Eliakim Chalakim? How did he come to an image like this? The answer is, it's named after this piece of kitsch salvage art known as Eliakim Chalakim, the Garbage Pail Kids. It's a trading card which just assembles all of the junk. So what Larry has done is to assemble all the junk of modernism in a similar way in this kind of elegant painting. But it's all grounded in an act of salvaging leftovers and ruins. So this is my last example, and it illustrates what I would call a shared character trait of Israelis and Palestinians, and that's what the Jews call chutzpah. That is just a refusal to give in and an insistence on affirming themselves. So this is actually a television commercial made by the Palestinians, and it's characteristic here in an occupied land with people who have no citizenship, no rights, are beset on every side. You would imagine that their ambitions would be modest, but this film shows you what the true ambitions of the Palestinian movement are.
برنامج توفير الأطفال حساب صغير بيعلمهم التوفير. بنك فلسطين، البنك الوطني الأول.
So I think that makes a kind of fitting conclusion to these reflections. And it suggests to me something about the Palestinian character of refusing to accept not only their condition, but thinking way beyond. I could talk a lot more about other artistic projects now, which are not so much asking the question, how do we resist in the present, how do we fight back, but what happens after we win? What happens, what will the peace look like? Because somebody has to think about that. And if it isn't the artists, I don't know who it'll be, because the politicians are terrible at thinking about it. Anyway, thank you very much. I'd be happy to take questions or comments of any kind. Yes?
I'm going back to the title of the Salvaging. I was wondering if it refers to an interest in salvaging something, or that the idea of Salvaging will produce what one is working for.
I think it's a bit of both. That is, it strikes me that this situation or state I'm calling Israel-Palestine is in a state of ruination. Physically, materially, the Palestinians are living among the ruins of a country, I mean, all around them. Those ruins are being produced by creative enterprises, buildings of walls, buildings of settlements. One of the things I didn't show from 5 Broken Cameras is the incredibly destructive effect that the settlements have on the Palestinian landscape. It's the dark side of urban renewal. Building security roads to connect, burning olive trees, bulldozing. I mean, the bulldozer has become the big symbol of destruction. So the Palestinians live among the ruins of their country. I think the Israelis live in a state of moral ruination. That is, of bad faith, bad conscience, guilt, anxiety, knowing that they are now regarded by the world as basically doing terrible evil to people over a very long period. I mean, the international justice system has condemned them so many times. It's so they're living in a state of denial, and that's something that needs to be salvaged as well. So moral ruins, physical ruins. I think that's why the arts are so important here, because they can show the truth, or they can take the facts and reframe them, rename them, produce some kind of new angle of vision on them. Or they can imagine something completely different, like our concluding commercial. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your exposition. I think it's superb for somebody to go and live with Palestinian or live under occupation and all that. But could you shed some light on art forms in 1948 occupied Palestine, where Palestinians in 1948 have produced art forms or something, and if possible, Gaza?
I couldn't really. I think the person who could do that and who has done it most effectively is Kamal Balata, a great Palestinian painter who wrote the first book on Palestinian art. And it goes back before 48 as well. It goes actually back to the 19th century and traces the vernacular arts, the folk arts, things like embroidery. A lot of Palestinian artists were also Christians, and some of them did the art of icons. So that's not my area of expertise. I'm mainly an art historian of the present, of contemporary. It's a perfectly good question, though, but I would suggest reading Balata's book.
I have the book.
You have it, okay. Good. Maybe you should, what do you think the art of 48 shows us that's relevant for today?
I think there are very rich expressions on the output of Palestinian 1948 people within geographic Palestine proper in 1948, especially in terms of rappers, singers, who sing half Hebrew, half Arabic, something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
There were a couple of more groups, working in this area. Plus, of course, others, plasticians, plastic artists.
Yeah.
I think it would be interesting to look at it from a postmodern perspective, because they do exist and they're quite active nowadays.
Okay, well, it's a great suggestion, and I'll follow it up. I'm actually going to meet for the first time with Kamal Bulata sometime in the coming year, I hope.
It's a great book, though.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. The other book, by the way, for anyways, is Bashir Makul, who teaches in Birmingham, England, has written a book called The Origins of Palestinian Art, which is very comprehensive survey. Some of my stuff is stolen, quite frankly, out of his book. So, yes.
I'd like to ask a bit about the collaboration aspect of your thesis of your presentation. And clearly, you focused on collaborations, if you will, that kind of try to salvage kind of a moral sense of the Palestine-Israel that they would like to see, the sense of a commonality, a sense of a common humanity.
Yeah.
There have been a lot of other collaborations across time, and some of them actually betrayed the existing power relationship. I recall in the 90s in Jerusalem, there was a theater collaboration to produce an Israeli-Palestinian Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah.
And the Romeo and Juliet, of course, I mean, it's the classic story, right?
Right.
War,
so which is which?
Fall in love.
Which is which? Which is the...
I think the Romeo was the Palestinian and the Juliet was the Israeli.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what ended up happening is that, in a way, skewing the narrative, that it's really about hatred, and if only we would stop hatred and we would love each other again, and that just kind of the oversimplification of what the conflict and what the issues are about between the Capulets and and the other one was the actual power relationship in terms of who produced it and who ran the show and who toured it to present that kind of narrative. This is almost entirely, So in other words, the Palestinians were the hired actors, most of whom were from inside Palestinian citizens of Israel, with a few from the Jerusalem. So the question is, it's not collaboration per se.
Right.
But rather it is collaboration that does tell the vision of the future.
Yeah, yes.
And if you would just say a couple of things on that.
Well, just, I mean, I think the fact that Romeo and Juliet is a comedy, fundamentally, that turns into a tragedy through mistakes, miscalculations, and so forth, misunderstandings, that I think it's a great story in that respect. The difference, though, for me, the one way that Romeo and Juliet is not quite appropriate is that it's about an ancient, feud between two families. Well, maybe it's right in the sense that there is a family resemblance and a connection. And remember, the Hebron film is about the milk cousins and the sharing of names and the sharing of a common language. My introduction to the Israel-Palestine conflict was in 1970. My wife and I had just been married 2 years earlier. Our first child was on the way, and we went to visit her, a dear friend of hers, American Jewish, who had married an Arab Jew who had emigrated from Libya. And we were having dinner one night, and we started talking about, what is the root of this conflict? And Judy had no doubt. She says, it's because they're anti-Semitic. The Arabs hate us. They want to kill us because we're Arabs. And Benny, of course, whose native language is Arabic, comes from Libya, says, Judy, that's crazy. They don't want to kill us because we're Jews. They want to kill us because we've stolen their land and we're not going to give it back. And that moment to me was, it told me a lot. For one thing, it made it clear that Israelis totally disagree with each other on the most fundamental questions. And that also, this was not about racism in the same way, or tribal loyalty. It was really about a historical tragedy. Something terrible happened, and I think that's also the moral of Azoulay's point, that the power of the Central Committee of Zionism in '48 turned the establishing of Israel, that cause, into an occasion for ethnic cleansing. I said, we have to get rid of as many Palestinians as possible. We want the whole country. And I think that's really been the unspoken. Now it's pretty much spoken. They used to deny it, but I think now it's out in the open, that they really do want the Palestinians to leave. And unfortunately for them, the Palestinians, I don't think, are inclined to do that. Yes?
Thank you, Professor Mitchell. I want to go back just to the previous question and what I understood as a very revealing spatial temporal confusion between the question and the questioner and the questionee, because I think the gentleman meant 48 in spatial terms, i.e. what others would call Israel, and you understood it in temporal terms, i.e. before the Nakba. Mm-hmm. But I want to follow that with the unsettling feeling I have coming out of this lecture about the true underlying racist logic of Zionism as a whole. Mm-hmm. And it's not an occasion of simple occurrence in 1948 that the expulsion took place. There's a long-standing and very prevalent tradition in Zionist discourse of the discussion of transfer, and this has been well established by numerous historians. So the Nakba isn't an accident; it's the culmination of a much longer tradition and, indeed, political agenda, it seems. And the added element to that is that, and I think this relates to the previous question too, is your discussion of the occupation as the object of study. Whereas perhaps there's an underlying logic to a wider and much longer state of oppression than simply the occupation, which refers to the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And notably, one piece of art and movie, in fact, that you didn't mention is Route 181, which is also a collaboration, which would fit perfectly well, which does not subscribe to the logic of the gaze towards the occupation. And I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit about that. And finally, once again, the same type of malaise, I feel, is your mentioning that the occupation can be, or the invisibility for common Israelis in Tel Aviv, say, of the occupation or the underlying racism of the Zionist project. What Route 181 shows quite brilliantly, I think, is the fallacy, and what you just mentioned, is the fallacy of this notion that the occupation or the oppression is invisible. Indeed, everyone knows, and every common Israeli knows that the house he's living in was inhabited before, and that the previous inhabitants were expulsed. And so I'm just expressing my malaise and my insistence, and I think it's wrong to appeal to none other than Edward Said to justify this attention towards the occupation, because I think what Edward Said brilliantly showed too is that there's a wider logic to the system that tells us morally and ethically to think about Zionism as a bigger phenomenon, as opposed to simply opposing the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, which the Palestinians have internalized. I think much to the Palestinian leadership has internalized that logic of fixating on the occupation, much to their destruction, in fact, as a moral.
What do you think they should focus on, if not the occupation?
A project of anti-racism, more largely,
Right.
as opposed to building some enclave of a pseudo-state that you, as you well show, some Palestinian artists are very adept at exposing. I think that.
Oh, well, thank you for
and
those
Route
remarks.
181, I think, shows that very brilliantly.
Yeah.
Route 181, which I don't know if you're familiar with,
I have seen.
follows the route of partition that was proposed by the UN. Interviewing, it's a documentary movie, also a collaboration with Sheikh Lefi and Emmanuel Sivan. Interviewing regular people. It goes through the West Bank, but it also goes through 48, the space that is 48, which is the area that became historic, and talks to common people.
Yeah.
And shows with absolute brilliance the fact that everyone knows what's going on. And the fact that the underlying logic of it has been its position from the start. So I appreciate the impulse to focus on moments of civil alliances or the Hebron affair. But I think it's also important to recognize and to affirm the underlying colonial logic involved.
Well, thank you. I mean, I hope it's clear that I absolutely accept that criticism, and perhaps, I think a lot more could be said about the resistance to colonialism and what forms that can take. One of the things we're doing next week is going to Bethlehem to visit a project called Decolonizing Architecture, which Sandy Halal and Alessandro Petti are working with. And that involves also projects, what I would call salvage art, inside refugee camps. Not just, but on the question of invisibility, I think it's a little more complicated than whether everybody knows or everybody sees. For one thing, we can't know what everybody does. Maybe my own testimony is influenced by an experience I once had on a flight back from Tel Aviv. I was sitting next to a perfectly nice guy, an anesthesiologist. We start off having a perfectly civil conversation, and then he asked me what I was doing. And I said I was giving lectures at Beirut University. And he said, what's that? And I said, it's one of the premier universities in the Palestinian territories, located near Ramallah. What were you doing there? Well, I have friends and colleagues there. I'm a professor, and they invited me to come and speak. And then I used the phrase occupied territories. And he said, what occupied territories? There is no occupation. There is a very substantial body of opinion which denies that and you know this is all about language. It's not just about what do you see, but what names do you give to things. And the word occupation is toxic for many Israelis. They do not want to hear that word because it reminds them of what they're doing. So I think it is actually invisible to many, not to all. And certainly the artists I talked about, the Israeli artists I talked about today, it's hyper visible. They think about it all the time and they can't escape it.
One more question.
One more question? Yes.
Just following on questions. You mentioned BDS, and you mentioned that you're part of the BDS movement. Am I correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and then you mentioned how many times you've been to Israel in 48. So following kind of this you don't seem to have a problem with contributing to the infrastructure of that state by your presence, and then building on that, the notion of collaboration, doesn't it too easily slip into a problem of normalization? And given the fact that the Israeli population as a whole is really, really supportive of Zionism, I mean, we're talking about like 95% of the Israeli population is pro-Jewish state at least in the 1948 lands, if not more. So this notion that you mentioned, Israeli resistance, that's just, it's not very, it doesn't have a constituency. There are no social forces on the ground that are really significant to claim, to hope for an Israeli resistance to the regime. And so, exactly because Zionism itself is such a racist, ethnocratic enterprise, which is based on ethnic cleansing. So in Mbappé, you were talking about things like regime change, or at least follow the South African model, and it took the whole world to including the Cuban military, and to change that. They wouldn't have to appeal to the white man in South Africa. So I just wanted to know, this notion of collaboration lends itself too easily, and I wanted to know how you feel about being in Israel.
I support the boycott. I will not accept invitations from Israeli universities. I used to, and I should tell you, it took me a while to sign up with the boycott. I was ambivalent about it because I have such a long relationship with scholars and artists who I think are very devotedly anti-Zionist within that country. And it breaks my heart to see how powerless they are, how the left in Israel has shrunk down to a very tiny minority. But for that very reason, I want to pay attention to them. I don't want to, and this is partly not political at all. It's simply a question of friendship, that I do not abandon my friends. I feel in solidarity with their resistance, and it doesn't matter if it's futile. It matters that it exists. That's the really important thing. I mean, there are lots of other things in your question that I could respond to, but I think the question of Zionism and racism, and this comes back to your point, Edward always, when they would say, okay, admit it, say it, Zionism is racism, he would say, Zionism is Zionism. For one thing, he knew that there was left Zionism that was socialist, that was devotedly anti-racist, that it wasn't one thing. And he wanted to acknowledge that because, and for another reason, he said, Palestinians need to learn from Zionism. If we're going to claim national identity on the basis of our genealogy as a people, there is a model for us to do it. Israel's similar to South Africa. I think it is an apartheid state now, but the white folks in South Africa were part of the forces that won the apartheid struggle. Black Sash, for instance, friends of ours were women against apartheid. Larry Abramson, the Israeli artist who I mentioned, is a voice crying in the wilderness in his own country. His parents were doctors in South Africa who fled apartheid. They couldn't bear it. They moved to Israel, and Larry said, we went from the frying pan to the fire. So the other terms, collaboration, normalization, we could talk a long time about those. As I said at the beginning, I want to find the tiny medicinal ingredient in the notion of collaboration. I agree that in many forms it's deservedly toxic. It's a bad word. Five Broken Cameras, I think, is a fantastic film, which I urge everybody to see it. And it is the product of direct collaboration. But the forms of collaboration I was much more interested in are not necessarily, oh, this Israeli and this Palestinian agreeing to work together on something. I think there's a bigger common project, decolonization, anti-racism, emancipation, and as for, final resolutions of the conflict, even to call it the conflict strikes me as it's language I'm not happy with. I would call it the colonization, ethnic cleansing, an attempt to basically expel a people. And so I hope I'm not underestimating the viciousness of that. But things like collaboration and normalization are also human activities that can play a role of resistance at certain moments. So,
Thank you.
yeah, I think that's enough.